Chapter 12. Working Out. Maddie stooped to take 8 loaves of bread from the oven. The sun was high in the sky and warming the whole kitchen like a bake oven. She wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her sleeve and put another 8 loaves into the oven. It would be a hot day, and she wanted to finish baking as soon as possible. It took 12 loaves of bread each week to feed the D.Y. Bontrager family. Word had spread quickly that Chris Borntrager's had girls old enough to work out, so Maddie soon had her old job back of being the maid. She missed her family terribly, but like Mother always said, if someone needs help, then we must do what we can. It would have been selfish to stay home just because she wanted to. Maddie put the last of the dishes in the cupboard and tidied the cabinet. Next, she swept the floor and began peeling potatoes for dinner. They could soak in cold water until time to fry, and this gave Maddie a head start on supper. By the time the last batch of bread was finished baking, she was ready to skip out of the kitchen and work on some sewing. It would be cooler in the living room, and the mending was a never-ending chore. Sometimes Maddie wondered if the Bontrager boys never watched out for barbed wire fences. When the bread had cooled and it was time to begin preparing dinner, Maddie carried the soft, fresh loaves to the cellar. It was a deep hole dug beneath the house with the entrance on the outside. A heavy wooden door covered the opening, slanting from the ground to about 3 feet up the side of the house. Maddie had to set the pan of bread on the ground to lift it and lay it back out of the way. She descended the steps to the cellar's dark coolness and smelled the wonderful aroma of hams and bacon. A fat, bear-like barrel sat in the corner, waiting for the fragrant loaves of bread. She lifted the lid and gently laid the loaves inside, being careful not to mash them. Then she returned the lid and went back up the stairs to the bright sunshine. That night, after everyone was asleep, someone, or something, crept into the cellar and stole 2 hams and several loaves of bread. No one heard a sound or suspected it until Maddie sent one of the little boys to the cellar to bring up a bacon for breakfast. "Maddie!" he shouted as he rounded the side of the house and practically flew in the kitchen door. "Somebody stole a bunch of the bread you baked yesterday and 2 hams." "What?" she asked as she turned to him. "Yeah, somebody stole some of your bread and the hams." Without a word, Maddie hurried down the steps and threw back the cellar door as though it were a feather. She rushed down the narrow steps and looked around. The lid of the barrel lay on the floor, but otherwise nothing was out of place. "Is this how you found it?" she asked the little boy who had followed on her heels. "Yep. The lid of the bread barrel was lying right there, and that's all you could see was wrong at first. Then when I picked up the bacon, I saw that 2 of the hams were gone." "Was the cellar door open?" "No," he said and shook his head. Puzzled, Maddie lifted the lid and placed it on the barrel again. At the breakfast table, she told the Bontrager family of their discovery. Immediately, the older boys were full of ideas on how to catch the robber, and Maddie was sure if they had their way, she wouldn't have to worry about stolen bread again. Suzanne, their mother, told them to please be careful and not hurt anyone, to please not get hurt themselves, and please, please don't speak so loudly. That night, the boys lay close by the windows, hoping the robber or robbers would return. But everything was quiet, and all that was lost was a little sleep. The next night was quiet too, and soon the boys decided that whoever had stolen the hams and bread had only been passing through and would not return. When Friday arrived, Maddie arose early to get the baking started before the sun rose too high. Once more, she stirred up enough dough for 12 loaves of bread. With arms strong from milking many cows, she kneaded the dough until it was smooth and elastic. Then she shaped them perfectly into oblong rolls and placed them into buttered bread pans. By the time they were baked and ready for the cellar, she had the house and kitchen in apple pie order and was ready to prepare dinner. When she put the bread into the barrel, she remembered the thief the week before. She considered putting something heavy on the lid, but decided against it. More than likely, it had been a cowboy in need of something to eat, and a 10-pound rock would not keep him out. She shrugged her shoulders and retraced her steps to the kitchen. But that night, the thief struck again. Nearly all the bread was taken this time, and just as before, it was done so quietly that no one heard it. Now the boys decided to sleep by the doorway. Surely they would hear someone walking past from there. But again, nothing happened and the robber was still free. The next week on bread baking day, the boys decided to sleep by the door before the robber had a chance to get the bread. By now, they were sure it was an animal that smelled Maddie's freshly baked bread. To their advantage, the moon was almost full and rose early. They pulled their quilts and blankets close to the open doorway and lay still, as though asleep. Maddie slept on the living room couch. Even though she had no privacy, she was too tired to care. She soon fell asleep. Suddenly, she was awakened by loud snickering and a scrambling of feet. She looked toward the kitchen door just in time to see the 4 older boys dive out the doorway. Then there was a terrible howling of many dogs as they screamed and screeched and scratched to get away from the boys, who were severely meting out justice. Away they went, yapping and baying in terror, until they could only be heard far in the distance. Then Maddie heard a muffled thump, thump, thump. She guessed the boys were putting rocks on the cellar door. She turned over and fell back to sleep. The next morning, they excitedly told the family about the pack of dogs they had chased off. But with the heavy rocks on the cellar door, they were sure no dog would open it now. To their surprise, when Maddie baked bread the next week, the rocks were removed and their bread was stolen again. This time, the boys decided to try another trick. They rigged up a trap and hid it just inside the cellar door. That night, they lay by the open doorway as before, waiting for the dogs to come. All was quiet, and Maddie was nearly asleep when suddenly there arose an ear-splitting howling and screeching. There was definitely a dog caught in the boys' trap. The boys scrambled out the door, and Maddie got up to watch the action. 2 of them were doubled over with laughter, while 2 others wrestled with the dog to pin him down. She chuckled to herself and wondered what they were planning to do with him. Soon, one of the boys ran back to her and asked for some tin cans. She hurried to the kitchen, and in the semi-darkness found 3. Without a word, he grabbed them from her and ran back to the cellar. Maddie watched from the doorway as the boys hurriedly tied a long piece of string to the dog's tail and spaced the 3 cans about 5 inches apart at the end. Then they carefully lifted the cellar door and opened the trap. The dog jumped and howled when he suddenly realized he was free. With a terrified scream, he bounded across the prairie in the same direction the other dogs had gone. Howling and screeching, he nearly flew along the ground, with the tin cans bumping and banging behind him. Occasionally, they hit a clump of grass or a pile of dirt that sent them bouncing high and hit him on his back. This would wrench another volley of screams from him and a fresh burst of speed. Maddie couldn't help chuckling, and the boys were slapping their knees and rolling on the ground laughing. From that night until Maddie was finished working for the Bontraggers, not another loaf of bread was stolen, and the boys were ever so proud of their remedy. Maddie had enjoyed working for them, but she eagerly looked forward to going home again. As far as she knew, no one else was aware that she was coming, so maybe she would be able to stay home for several weeks this time. One of the older boys took her home in their wagon. Just as they pulled into the yard, she noticed a cloud of dust on the horizon. "Looks like someone is coming," the boy pointed toward the dust cloud. "Yep," Maddie nodded as she lifted her suitcase from the wagon bed. "Probably father, or one of the boys." She turned toward the house and saw Lydia standing in the doorway with a happy smile on her face. Turning to the boy, she waved and told him goodbye. Then she wearily walked to the house and set her suitcase just inside the door. "So you're home." Mother smiled at her from the kitchen where she was washing beans for supper. "Sure am." Maddie sank onto the couch and asked Lydia where Mary was. "She's working for Tobes." "Oh," Maddie nodded. "What have you been doing?" Lydia looked at Mother and they laughed together. "We haven't been doing anything, have we, Mother?" Mother laughed and shook her head. "Not a thing." Actually, they had been very busy getting the pinto beans ready for threshing, and Mother was glad to have Maddie at home to help. Father and the boys mowed the beans. After they were dry, Mother and Lydia had been putting them on piles for the threshing machine. Just then, a dusty Model T with no top and its fenders rusted and peeling paint chugged into the yard and stopped with a cough and a sputter. "Oh, that must be what we saw out on the prairie a while ago," Maddie said, rising to her feet and looking out the window. A strange man climbed out of the car and walked up to the door. He took off his cap and smoothed his hair. Mother dried her hands on her apron and went to greet him, while Maddie and Lydia listened quietly inside. "Are you Mrs. Borntrager?" he asked. "Yes, I am," Mother answered. Maddie thought she sounded funny speaking English. "Somebody told me you have girls that go around helping people who are in need." Mother only nodded. "My wife is very sick, and we need someone to do the washing. We have 4 children, and my wife's mother is there to do the cooking, but she's not strong enough to do the washing, and I'm busy trying to get the beans cut. So, I was wondering if one of your girls could come and help us get the washing done. We haven't washed in about 4 weeks." His voice trailed off. Maddie's heart sank. She had been planning to stay at home for a while, and now she wasn't home 5 minutes before someone needed her. "Yes, our oldest girl is at home right now, and she can help you," Maddie heard Mother say. Mother turned toward Maddie and asked if she could just take her suitcase as it was. Maddie motioned for Mother to come to her. She wanted to talk to her, but didn't want the man to hear. "Do I have to go, Mother?" "They really need help, Maddie." "But we don't even know this man." "I know, but if they haven't washed in over a month, they really need someone to help." "But how can we know we can trust him?" Maddie fought back tears. "We just have to, Maddie," Mother insisted. So Maddie went with the stranger, sincerely hoping that Mother was right. The Model T rolled across the ground so easily, even without a horse to pull it. There were no roads, so the man just struck off across the prairie at a westerly angle. Maddie wondered if he knew where he was going. But then she remembered that she had thought the same thing when Father brought them home from Springer the night they had arrived from Kansas. Yet somehow they had arrived at home. The sun was sinking low in the west and the air was already cooling. Suddenly they swerved sharply to the right. "Snake," explained the man. He stopped the car, got out, picked up a large rock, then drove back to find the snake. It was still coiled in the same spot. The man drew the Model T alongside it and stopped. He moved the gear shift into neutral, then picked up the rock and stood on the seat. Maddie peered over the side of the car door and was surprised to find the largest rattlesnake she had ever seen. It was nearly as big around as the top of her arm. The man lifted the rock high over his head and threw it down with all his strength. It smashed into the snake's head with a sickening crunch, and the snake writhed in anguish. After a few minutes, it lay still in death. The man jumped over the car door and kicked it. When it didn't move, he picked up the rock and threw it onto the snake's head again. Then, satisfied that it was dead, he didn't bother to open the car door but stepped nimbly over it, put the car into gear, and drove away. Maddie shuddered to think what a snake like that could have done to someone walking, or to a horse. She was glad to be in an automobile. After they had driven across the prairie for quite some time, she suddenly noticed the top of a windmill rising over a dip in the land. The man turned the steering wheel sharply, and the next instant they were hurtling down over a steep hillside. His farm lay at the bottom. She wondered why he had put his farm buildings in such an unlikely place. Surely it must be hotter in the summertime with no breezes off the prairie to cool them. Maybe it had been winter when he found the place, and the steep hillside had seemed to be a natural protection from the wild blizzards that blew. They rolled to a stop in front of a small house. 4 young children, as dirty as any she had ever seen, stood in the doorway. They looked at Maddie cautiously, and suddenly Maddie was glad she had come. Certainly this family was in need of her help. An elderly woman stood at the stove stirring a pot of beans. A piece of tin was propped against the stove to keep the door closed. The room was tidy, but dirty and in need of a good scrubbing. The little children minded their grandmother well and worked quickly, setting the table and helping her get supper on. The man showed Maddie where she was to sleep, and again it was on the couch. Whose couch would she sleep on tomorrow night, she wondered. She laid her black bonnet on the mantel and the suitcase on a chair close by. Then the grandmother called her to the table for supper. The children began helping themselves to the food as soon as they sat down, so Maddie quietly bowed her head to pray, and when she finished, she discovered they had bowed their heads too. That evening, Maddie ate the best biscuits she had ever tasted in her life. The food was not plentiful, but what little was there was simply delicious. The children ate silently, and the father spoke only when spoken to, which was not often. Only the grandmother visited with Maddie, so she asked her what was wrong with their daughter. "She has dropsy and keeps going from bad to worse," the grandmother answered gravely. "Well, maybe just knowing the children have clean clothes and are bathed will help her feel better," said Maddie. The grandmother nodded sadly, and nothing more was said about the mother. Soon the father left the table, and Maddie knew it was a painful experience for him. Early the next morning, Maddie arose and began gathering the clothes and sorting them. The man brought a large washtub into the kitchen and set it on the stove. While it was heating, he carried water from the pump to the tub. Then he set another tub in the yard and carried rinse water to it. Maddie stripped the beds and, with the grandmother's help, changed the sick mother's bed sheets. When the water was hot, the man helped her carry the steaming tub to the yard. Maddie found the washboard in the pantry and began the long task of scrubbing the clothes and wringing them out. She washed the sheets and spread them on top of a pile of deer antlers to dry. Then she washed the towels and underwear and night clothes. Last of all, she washed the filthy pants, shirts, and dresses of the children and the father's overalls. By noon, she had finished washing the clothes and was ready to bathe the children. The grandmother helped with the 2 little ones. Then she and Maddie took a wash basin, bathed the sick mother, and put fresh clothes on her. Finally, after everyone was bathed, she washed the dirty clothes they had been wearing. After dinner, Maddie swept the kitchen and with a stiff straw broom began scrubbing the rough plank floor. She sloshed water on the floor and scrubbed and scrubbed. Then she swept the dirty water out the door and began the process all over again. By evening, the floor was dry, the clothes were dry, and everything was shining clean. The dirty water seemed thick enough to cut. With a good, satisfied feeling, Maddie dumped it out to water the young pear tree in the yard. That evening, the biscuits the grandmother baked were light and fluffy, and Maddie wished she could have such biscuits every day. The children seemed happier. The grandmother was talkative. The father smiled. And Maddie was so glad she had come. End of chapter 12.